A shabby-looking man, dressed in a worn-out jacket and scuffed shoes, stood afar, hesitant and gazing at a bank. But this wasn't just any bank. He was looking at one of the most prestigious financial institutions, not only in Spain, but in the entire world, where only the wealthiest elites conducted their business. The building was no less than a castle, with several high-end luxury cars parked outside. Inside, the marble floors gleamed beneath massive crystal chandeliers. The man walked into the lobby, which was filled with people dressed in tailored suits and expensive watches. His messy hair and tired expression immediately marked him as out of place. The young teller behind the counter raised an eyebrow as he approached, giving him a quick once-over. A smirk played at the corner of her mouth.
Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?
I saw a bank on the sign outside, so I think I am.
This isn't just any bank. This is Banco del Sol, one of the most exclusive financial institutions in the world.
I know. I'd like to withdraw $10 million from my account.
What?
The man placed his client card on the desk. The teller couldn't believe her eyes because it was unlike any card she had ever seen. The unique design threw her off for a moment. She took a closer look, but still didn't recognize it.
Can you wait a moment?
The teller went in the back and showed the card to her colleagues. They all shook their heads in disapproval. The teller smirked and looked at the man in disgust before calling for security.
We get people like you all the time trying to scam the bank.
Hey!
The man was immediately surrounded by security guards who tried to drag him out, but his strong physique made it difficult. The bank manager noticed the commotion on the CCTV and rushed out.
What's going on here?
He's probably some druggie trying to scam the bank.
The teller handed the card to the manager. His eyes widened as he examined it. Instantly, he signaled the security guards to back off. He made a slight bow to the man.
Sir, would you mind stepping into my office for a moment?
The man followed the manager into a luxurious office. The manager gestured for him to sit and place the card on the table. He opened his laptop and turned it toward the man.
Please enter your password.
I don't think I remember it.
Now, I am sure you stole it.
The manager smirked and picked up the phone, but the man noticed a biometric option next to the password field. Without saying a word, he placed his thumb on the scanner. The biometric verification succeeded, and the account opened. The phone slipped from the manager's hand as he saw the screen. His eyes widened in shock as the account information loaded. The account held a staggering amount of wealth, far beyond anything the bank had ever handled. The amount of the net worth displayed took the manager's breath away, and his face turned pale.
I'm so sorry, sir. Please forgive the misunderstanding. I had no idea who you were.
The manager stood, looked at the man, and bowed slightly in front of the man.
If there's anything you need, sir, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. I'll personally manage your accounts and assist you with any financial advice you require. This is the opportunity of a lifetime for me, Mr.
This man was Steve Calder, and a year ago, his life had been entirely different, until everything changed the night before his wedding. Steve had been engaged to Sarah for a year, and now the day they had been planning for so long was just around the corner. In his hands, he carried a glass box filled with calla lilies, the very flowers Sarah had dreamed of decorating the chapel with. Although they hadn't been available, Steve wanted everything to be perfect for her, so he had them specially shipped. He hadn't told her he was coming, imagining the surprise and joy on her face when she saw them. But as he stepped inside the house, his world came crashing down when he heard screams coming from the bedroom. Steve rushed toward the bedroom and found Sarah lying in bed, but she wasn't alone. Another man was with her. Steve's heart plummeted. He stood there, paralyzed, as Sarah hurried to cover herself, her eyes wide with shock, and the man next to her went pale.
Steve, please, I'm so sorry. It's not what it looks like.
But Steve couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Time seemed to stop, and the only sound he could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rage against the betrayal. But instead, he turned on his heel and bolted out the door. Steve sped down the road, tears welling in his eyes as the night blurred past him. He stormed into his house and slammed the door shut. Steve hurled the glass box of flowers against the wall, shattering it into pieces. He yelled and screamed at the top of his lungs before collapsing onto the couch. Tears streamed down his face. His eyes landed on a framed photo of him and Sarah hanging on the wall. The pain in his chest began to shift, and anger quickly replaced the numbness. He couldn't leave things like this. He needed to confront her, to demand answers. No, he wasn't going to let it end this way. Just as Steve was about to storm out, a knock echoed through the house. He froze, confused. He wasn't expecting anyone.
Civil Guard, open up.
Steve cautiously opened the door, only to be met by several armed officers in tactical gear standing on his doorstep.
Hands where we can see them, don't move.
What the hell is going on?
We have a warrant to search the premises. We received intel that you're involved in drug trafficking. We're here to search your apartment for narcotics.
Drugs! I don't even freaking smoke!
The officers ignored his protests and signaled the rest of the team to start searching the apartment. Steve, still in shock, could only stand helplessly as they tore through his home. They rifled through cabinets, emptied drawers, and pulled apart the furniture. As the search continued, one of the officers suddenly called out.
Here, found something.
An officer held up a small bag of white powder, cocaine.
No, this can't be right. That's not mine. I don't even know how that got here.
More drugs began to appear hidden in cupboards, tucked into corners of the house, and in the furniture. They were bags of cocaine and other narcotics Steve had never seen before.
Please, you've got to believe me.
Mr. Calder, you are under arrest for drug trafficking. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you.
The officer slapped handcuffs on Steve's wrists, and he was led out of his apartment. His neighbors peeked out from behind their doors, whispering and watching as he was shoved into the back of the police van. The doors slammed shut, and the van sped away. In just a matter of minutes, Steve had lost everything. He was betrayed by the woman he loved and accused of a crime he didn't commit. Steve sat in a small room, strapped to a cold metal chair. The walls were bare, except for a large mirror on one side. He knew it wasn't just a mirror, and he's being watched. The door opened, and a detective strolled in. He circled Steve slowly, sizing him up, before taking a seat directly in front of him.
There are two ways this conversation can go, the hard way or the easy way. Now, personally, I enjoy the hard way, but I'm going to give you a chance to try your luck with the easy one. Are you involved in drug trafficking?
I've already told your men this is a mistake.
Well, I'm glad we got the easy part out of the way.
I swear I don't know anything about those drugs. You've got the wrong guy.
Then what were they doing in your house?
I don't know. Someone must have planted them.
So, you're telling me someone came into your house, hid drugs in multiple places, and left without you noticing?
Yes.
The detective smiled. He expected this response. Without a word, he pressed a button on the table. The door swung open, and two men entered the room. They grabbed Steve by the arms, yanking him out of the chair, and dragged him down a narrow hallway to another room. This room was darker, colder, and at its center stood a large metal tub filled with ice-cold water. Before Steve could react, they forced his head into the freezing water. The shock hit him instantly. His chest tightened, and he struggled against the firm grip of the officers, gasping for air. His lungs burned as he fought the urge to breathe, and just when he felt he couldn't hold on any longer, they yanked him up. Steve sputtered and coughed, water dripping from his face as he gulped in air. The detective stood calmly nearby, watching and smiling.
Who are you working for?
No one!
They plunged his head into the water again, this time holding him down longer. The icy water numbed his skin, and he screamed for oxygen. He thrashed desperately, but the hands held him firm. Just as he thought he would drown, they pulled him up again. Gasping and choking, Steve's vision blurred and the room started spinning around him.
I don't think you understand how this works, Steve.
They dragged him back to the original interrogation room and threw him onto the cold, hard floor. Before Steve could catch his breath, the officers started beating him. Each punch sent jolts of pain through his body, and his vision darkened with every hit. But no matter how much they hurt him, he couldn't give them what they wanted. He didn't know what they were asking for. After what felt like hours, the assault finally stopped. Steve lay on the floor, panting. The detective kneeled next to him.
You can stop this, Steve. Just give us the names.
Steve didn't respond. He couldn't. His body was battered and broken.
Let's see how tough you are.
Steve is thrown into a cell. The next morning, the torture repeated itself. Day after day, the same routine. Beatings, ice water, and suffocating pain. Steve barely recognized his own face in the mirror anymore. And then, one day, they dragged him into a new room. There was a chair in the middle, equipped with straps on the arms and legs. They forced him into the chair and tied him down. The detective entered, standing beside a control
This
panel.
chair is capable of delivering a lethal dose of electricity, but I've adjusted it just enough so you'll feel the pain without dying.
I swear I am not lying.
One last time, Steve. Are you involved in drug trafficking or not?
How do I convince you I have nothing to do with it?
The officers placed electrodes on Steve's body. The detective pressed a button, and a jolt of electricity surged through him. Steve screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the crackling of the electrical currents. Every nerve in his body was on fire. When the shock ended, his body went and slumped in the chair. The detective crouched beside him once again.
You know how this ends, Steve. If I were you, I'd stop resisting. It's going to get much worse.
Yes.
What?
Yes, I'm involved.
Prepare him for the hearing.
The detective smiled as he straightened up. The straps around Steve's body were loosened. He collapsed forward, barely able to stay conscious. The detective walked out of the room, leaving him on the floor. The officers dragged him to his cell and locked him up. The next day, Steve was taken to court for sentencing. He sat in the back of the police vehicle, contemplating what his future might look like. The car pulled up in front of the courthouse, where a large crowd of reporters and journalists had gathered. The officers pulled Steve out of the vehicle and led him through the throng of people into the courthouse. Cameras flashed and voices called out, but Steve barely noticed. He was escorted down long hallways until they reached the courtroom. Prosecutors sat at one table, flipping through files, while Steve's court-appointed lawyer sat quietly at the other. The detective who had interrogated Steve stood near the prosecutor's desk. Steve was led to the defendant's stand, his heart pounding.
All rise.
The judge entered the room. She ascended to the bench and took her seat. The prosecutor rose first to lay out the case against Steve.
Your Honor, the defendant, Steve Calder, was apprehended by the Civil Guard for involvement in a major drug trafficking operation. Significant amounts of illegal narcotics were discovered in his residence, including cocaine and other controlled substances.
The case was presented, and all the evidence pointed squarely at Steve. As he sat there, listening, he couldn't help but wonder who would go to such lengths to frame him. His thoughts kept returning to the man he had found with Sarah. The detective presented his testimony next, detailing how they received an anonymous tip about Steve. They followed the lead, uncovering what they claimed was a major trafficking operation. The detective informed the court that Steve had confessed to the crime during interrogation.
Mr. Calder, how do you plead to the charges of drug trafficking?
Guilty, Your Honor.
The judge finalized the paperwork and began delivering her verdict.
Mr. Calder, you have admitted your involvement in a serious crime. Drug trafficking not only destroys communities but fuels violence and addiction. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your guilty plea is duly noted. For the crime of drug trafficking, I hereby sentence you, Stephen Calder, to 5 years in a state correctional facility.
The gavel came down on the desk, and the fate of Steve's next 15 years was sealed. The guards moved toward him and led him out of the courtroom. The prison van stopped outside the state penitentiary. The doors swung open and Steve was pulled out. The huge iron gates of the prison were open and he was shoved inside. The guards escorted him through a series of long hallways. They walked narrow barred windows until they arrived at the intake room. Behind a metal desk, a guard handed a clipboard to one of the men leading Steve. The guards removed Steve's handcuffs and motioned for him to undress. He hesitated for a moment, but then started taking off his clothes. Everything was tossed into a plastic bin. He stood naked in front of the officers, exposed and vulnerable. After a moment, one of the guards tossed him a prison uniform with his inmate number stitched on the front. Steve put on the uniform, and they shoved him into a small room where a camera was already set up. A guard stood behind it, ready to take his mugshots. Steve did as he was told. He turned to give all the required angles for the photos. Once the shots were taken, he was dragged down another narrow hallway. He could hear the other prisoners talking, laughing, and sizing him up as he passed. The guards led him past row after row of cell doors until they reached his assigned cell. A guard slid open the metal door and pushed Steve inside. The cell was small and bare. It had a bunk bed with a thin, worn-out mattress on a steel frame and a metal toilet bolted to the wall. The guard locked the cell door and walked away. Steve stood frozen, taking in his surroundings. The weight of his reality hit him hard. 15 years. He had no idea how he was going to survive this. Slowly, he walked over to the lower bunk and sat down, burying his face in his hands. Suddenly, a raspy voice broke the silence.
Don't worry, it gets better.
Steve jerked his head up, startled. He immediately stood and looked at the top bunk, where an old man lay coughing. The man was frail, his skin sagging and body gaunt, but there was something unnerving about him. Despite his sickly appearance, an intimidating aura clung to him. His dark, hollow eyes held a strange, unsettling energy.
I don't think it will.
The old man smiled faintly and slowly stepped down, locking eyes with Steve. His voice was so heavy, each word seemed to pierce through Steve like a jolt of electricity.
You know, I haven't had a partner in a long time.
Why?
Because I didn't want one.
Steve shook his head and sat back down on his bunk. He didn't have the energy to deal with this. To him, the old man was probably some deranged murderer, lost in the last days of his life. Steve lay back down on the lower bunk, staring up at the metal frame above him.
You'll get used to it. Everyone does eventually.
The old man's words ignited a spark of anger in Steve. He immediately grabbed the top bunk in frustration.
Only those who've done something wrong find peace here. I'm not a criminal, so keep your fucking advice to yourself.
I'm just trying to help.
I don't need your help. You have no idea what it feels like to have your life ripped apart in a matter of hours. I was supposed to be married by now, living a happy life, probably on my honeymoon. But no, some criminal like you decided to screw everything up, and now I'm here. So no, it won't get better for me, and you can shut the hell up.
All right. I hear you.
He lay back down, pulling the thin blanket over himself. Then he closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. No matter how hard he tried to block out everything, the thoughts swirled in his mind. He decided to keep his eyes shut and wait, hoping that eventually, exhaustion would pull him into sleep. The next morning, Steve was jolted awake by the sound of metal rods clanging against the cell doors. He was unable to stretch as every inch of his body was sore from the hard bed.
Line up for roll call.
Steve climbed out of his bunk and joined the other inmates in line. After roll call, he headed straight for the bathroom. As he walked down the corridor, he noticed two prisoners watching him. They exchanged smirks but said nothing. Steve ignored them and continued on his way. Inside the bathroom, the showers were covered by thin, tattered curtains that offered little privacy. Steve found an empty stall, quickly undressed, and turned on the faucet. As the water hit him, he began to wash, but a faint rustling sound behind him made him pause. He turned, scanning the room, but no one was there. He waited a moment longer, listening for anything unusual, but the room was silent. Shaking off the feeling, Steve turned the water back on. Just as he began to relax, the curtain behind him was violently yanked open. 5 men stepped into the small space, blocking his way out.
What the hell?
You can scream if you want, and we'll make this your everyday. Or you can stay quiet and it'll be over before you know it.
Steve froze, paralyzed by fear. His mind raced, unable to process what was happening. One of the prisoners moved closer, trying to pin him against the wall. Steve shoved the man back, but another prisoner grabbed him from the side. Together, they tried to restrain him, but Steve fought harder, pushing them off with all his strength. He made a break for the exit, but one of the men stuck out his leg, tripping him. Steve hit the wet floor hard, his body slamming into the cold tiles. The group pounced, trying to overpower him. They grabbed him back and tried to sexually assault him. Desperate, Steve resisted, holding off harder. Enraged, their leader began beating him as they held him tightly and cheered on. Blood dripped from his nose and mouth as they brutalized him. Then, suddenly, the assault stopped and Steve fell on the floor. He looked up in confusion. The 5 men stood frozen in place, slowly backing away. In the doorway stood the old man, casually holding a towel over his shoulder. The prisoners who had been attacking Steve silently slipped away, vanishing without a word. The old man walked over and reached down, pulling Steve to his feet.
You all right?
Yeah.
He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Slowly, he returned to the shower and turned the water back on. As the water hits his body, the blood and the dirt from the fight swirled down the drain, passing his birthmark on the lower back that resembled a scorpion. Steve entered the cafeteria where food was being served. He looked at the buffet laid out before him. Trays of bland, unappetizing food filled the table. There was grayish mashed potatoes, overcooked vegetables, and a lump of something resembled meat but smelled like rubber. His stomach churned at the sight. Every dish made him feel nauseous. Steve reluctantly grabbed a piece of dry bread and a glass of water. He turned to scan the crowded seating area. Every table was packed with prisoners, eating and murmuring in low tones. He didn't want to sit with any of them. At the end of the hall, the old man sat alone at his table. Steve hesitated for a moment before deciding to join him.
Mind if I sit?
The old man nodded and Steve sat down. For a few minutes, they ate in silence.
Why were they scared of you?
I don't know.
I don't buy that. Those guys back there, they're all probably in some gang, built like they could rip someone apart. You look like you can barely throw a punch, but they backed off. No one even dared to say a word to you. What's really going on?
You should ask them.
Steve shook his head, focusing on his food without responding.
I saw a scar on your back. Doesn't look like you lived a peaceful life out there.
It's a birthmark. My mother said my father had it too.
Is he dead?
I don't know. He disappeared when I was 10.
My family died when I was young, too. We got caught in the crossfire between 2 rival gangs. I was the only one who survived, but a bullet hit my lung. Didn't matter much back then, but the wound's catching up to me now.
I am sorry, but it's different. My father didn't die. He abandoned us. Walked out one day and never came back. Didn't even leave a note.
Everyone has their reasons, even for leaving.
I wonder what the reason was for my fiancé cheating on me.
Life's full of reasons you'll never understand.
How have you survived in here for so long?
Because I had something to look forward to.
What?
Doesn't matter. What matters is that you need to find something. Something to help you pass the time. To keep you from going mad in here.
Steve sank into the mundane routine of prison life. His days start blending together in a haze of monotony. Every morning he woke up to the sound of metal rods clanging against the bars of his cell. He would stumble out of bed, shower in the dimly lit bathroom, and head to the mess hall for breakfast. The rest of the day was a cycle of doing chores around the prison, scrubbing floors, cleaning hallways, and folding laundry. But as soon as his duties were done, Steve would head straight for the gym. It became his safe space, the one place where he could channel the burning vengeance that developed inside him. In his cell, Steve had created a calendar on the wall by scratching small marks into the concrete. Each mark represented a day, a countdown to the end of his 5-year sentence. Every time he carved another line, he imagined the day he would finally be free to confront Sarah and hunt down the man she cheated with. In his mind, he pictured them living a happy life, maybe married by now, enjoying the life that had been stolen from him. But all of that was going to change. He was determined to make them pay, to tear their world apart as they had done to his. The gang members didn't bother him anymore. Steve spent most of his time with the old man. The old man helped him work out, giving him tips and pushing him harder each day. Slowly, Steve's body began to transform. The months passed, and Steve's once lean frame became bulkier, more muscular. His body was now ripped, and each muscle was defined. The mundane prison life no longer consumed him. His focus was entirely on becoming stronger, preparing for the day when he would leave this place. An entire year passed. One day, as Steve was deep into his workout at the gym, bench pressing more than he ever thought he could a year ago, a guard approached him.
Hey, Calder.
Steve set the barbell down and sat up.
Yeah?
You've got a visitor.
Who?
Don't know, but they're waiting in the visitor's room. Let's go.
Steve stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and followed the guard out of the gym. Steve walked into the visitor's room. As he approached the glass panel, his breath caught in his throat, and a flood of emotions hit him. He froze.